Alectinib is another second-generation inhibitor in the same sort of general class as ceritinib and brigatinib. Alectinib was first developed in Japan by Chugai and was first tested in Japanese patients. This group of Japanese patients had ALK-rearranged lung cancer and had not received prior crizotinib. So they were a TKI naive group, and they reported in their first study of alectinib that it was highly efficacious in this population. So that was already kind of a sign that this is a very active drug. The response rate was over 93%, and the median progression-free survival was exceeding 29 months in a TKI naive population. Based on that work and some other work, there were a phase 1 and phase 2 studies launched outside of Japan, and actually it was 2 phase 2 studies which eventually led to accelerated approval of alectinib for crizotinib-resistant patients. One of the phase 2 studies was a global study of alectinib in patients with crizotinib resistance. The second phase 2 study was a North American study that enrolled just crizotinib-resistant patients. And the 2 studies were remarkably similar in terms of the results. So what they found is that alectinib is highly active in crizotinib-resistant patients. The response rate in both studies was around 50%. And the median progression-free survival in both studies was between 8 and 9 months. Now, it's very difficult to do cross-trial comparisons, but extrapolating from the ceritinib data, the ceritinib studies, and now the alectinib studies, some might suggest that alectinib may be a little more active. However, I think we would need a head-to-head comparison to really be able to compare the second-generation inhibitors. All we can really tell from these separate trials is that these second-generation inhibitors are very active. I would say for alectinib in particular, the CNS activity has been very notable. ALK-positive patients unfortunately have a propensity to develop central nervous system metastases, including parenchymal brain metastases, leptomeningeal disease, intramedullary spinal cord metastases. They're very susceptible to spread of disease to the CNS. So this is a huge problem in this particular population of lung cancer patients. And fortunately, alectinib is very active in the CNS. It penetrates the blood-brain barrier to very high levels, achieving concentrations near even what's achieved in the plasma. And what we saw in the phase 2 studies of alectinib is that alectinib was able to induce responses in the CNS in over half of the patients. So their intracranial response rates ranged from about 50 to 70% in the phase 2 studies. Now, the efficacy and the safety from those 2 phase 2 studies led to FDA approval and also approval outside the US as well. Alectinib is a very well-tolerated drug. Again, comparing to other ALK inhibitors, I think some would even argue that alectinib may be the easiest of all the ALK inhibitors in terms of side effects. However, there are some common side effects. I would say the most common ones are fatigue, constipation, muscle aches, and edema. I think the ones that the one that is most notable with alectinib is myalgias or muscle aches. It's somewhat unique with alectinib compared to other ALK inhibitors. Patients often will describe feeling like they ran a marathon and all of their muscles are very sore. We know that this can be due to irritation of the muscles, and so we do track a particular lab test called CPK, or creatinine phosphokinase, and we track that every 2 weeks for the first few months of therapy, and oftentimes that marker will track with a patient's muscle symptoms. Now, the interesting thing about the myalgias from alectinib is it generally is a short-lived phenomenon. It tends to peak in the first month or 2, and then assuming patients are tolerating it well, oftentimes the muscle symptoms will resolve on their own. And then as patients continue on treatment, they generally do not report that those muscle symptoms recur. The other side effects to stay on top of with alectinib include constipation. So often I do have to remind my patients about drinking plenty of fluids and being on a regular bowel regimen so that the constipation doesn't become a bigger problem. And then the last side effect, just again to make sure that you're on top of with alectinib-treated patients, is edema. It's typically not as significant as with crizotinib, but it can occur in patients. It can be cumulative, meaning that it worsens over time, and sometimes it will require diuretic therapy.
So one of the bigger problems in clinical care in patients with ALK-rearranged lung cancer is progression in the brain or CNS. Crizotinib has been a very effective therapy at controlling systemic disease and is a drug that does get into the brain and can delay or prevent CNS progression. But ultimately, that is the source of most patients' progression, is going to be in the brain. And can we find a strategy to either delay that or deal with it when it occurs? We already have traditional means of things like radiation therapy in the form of whole brain radiation or stereotactic radiosurgery, and we even use surgery in some cases with patients with isolated metastases. But ultimately, the promise of second or next generation TKIs, such as ceritinib and alectinib, is to get better control of cancer in the brain. And that's really where these drugs have shown great use, great utility so far, is that you can have a patient do very well on crizotinib, you can have progression in the brain, and then you can employ ceritinib, alectinib, and get control of those lesions in the brain and maintain control or regain control systemically as well. It's been a great addition for patients.
The second generation TKI is distinguished from the first generation by its ability to penetrate the CNS system. There have been actually a study of this second generation TKI in patients with brain metastases. Namely, there's the exon 2 and exon 3, and there are actually subgroup of patients with known brain metastases. However, only a portion of them have measurable disease, so the response rate is estimated in anywhere between about 35 to about 50%. So there is a reasonable chance of a patient having the brain metastases from the ALK positive tumor may have responded to ceritinib. Now, on the other hand, Alectinib is also been known to have a CNS penetration effect, namely using a single-arm study reported by Dr. Aul, and that there is actually approximately close to about 50% chance of the tumor being responsive to the Alectinib. So in other words, overall, I will looking at similar type of CNS response rate with ceritinib or Alectinib with patients with brain metastases.